Hello and welcome to Occult Book Review. This week's book is Sons of God by Acharya S, also known as D.M. Murdoch. The hypothesis of this book, and I suppose all of Acharya S's work, is that Jesus was a mythical figure, and in this particular book she argues that also Buddha and Krishna were mythical figures, and she also talks about other pagan gods, sun gods, and she shows how the symbols that recur in all of their life stories are actually attributes of the sun and the sun's journey. If I were to say to you that The Tempest and Forbidden Planet were the same story, you could say to me, no, they're not. One is set on another planet, one is set on an island. If I said to you that The Lion King and Hamlet are the same story, you could pick out, on a literal level, you could pick out so many differences that you could say to me, it's impossible. You could make a great argument and you could defeat me and say, this story is not the same as that story. However, if you look beneath literalism and look at the symbolism and the motifs in all of these stories, you can find that they are in fact the same story, the same journey. Apocalypse Now, Heart of Darkness, it's the same story. But if you're going to argue from a literalist point of view, it's very easy to show that they're not the same story at all. And this is what happened, in my opinion, to Acharya S when she tried to confront Christians in particular about Jesus also being the Son and Buddha and Krishna also being that same figure. There's a great line in David Lewis Williams' book, The Mind in the Cave, which I also recommend. And he says at the start, we don't have to explain everything in order to explain something. And in the context of Acharya S's work, I think that's very apt, because sometimes the same symbols don't appear in the same order. And there are various reasons for that. Simply, I suppose you could say cultures change over time. One obvious example is the idea of the tree. Jesus, in the original versions, which aren't so popular, of his crucifixion, is hung from a tree. Krishna is shot with an arrow underneath a tree. Buddha achieves wisdom under a tree. You could even say Odin is hung from a tree in order to achieve his wisdom. So the tree is the symbol here, and yet it appears in different contexts. So should we throw that away then and say that there's nothing common here? Well, that's what happened to Acharya S when she would bring up symbols like this to Christian literalists who had their own way of reading the Bible. Of course, if you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, then I suppose it's very hard for you. You're conditioned already to not accept things like that, ideas like that. It can be traumatic if you try to pull yourself away. Equally, another stumbling block for Acharya S was the idea of the virgin birth and immaculate conception. I found that throughout the arguments I would find online, there was this interchanging of those terms, a virgin birth or immaculate conception. It seemed that people didn't realize that these are two different things. An immaculate conception is a miraculous birth. So Krishna is born of an immaculate conception, but not a virgin birth, although in some stories he is born of a virgin, in the same way as sometimes Isis is called a virgin. But Krishna is also known as being the 8th son as well, so obviously the virgin context becomes problematic there. Jesus, of course, is famously born of a virgin, but Acharya S shows in this book that she believes the virgin in this context to be the constellation of Virgo. She associates Jesus with the winter solstice, like an awful lot of pagan deities, Attis, Dionysus, to name two. So you see the same symbolism arising, but at different times, in the same way as Jesus dies for 3 days and is born again. Okay, so he dies for 3 days and then he's born again at Easter. But this is also associated with the winter solstice. So straight away the literalist will say, oh, there you go, you're completely wrong. However, the symbolism is still the same. We need to, Acharya S is arguing that we need to get over that particular, what would you say, stumbling block, I suppose, or try to see the story for the allegory that she believes. It's also worth remarking upon the coincidences when it comes to the solar phenomenon of the analemma. Now, the analemma is the figure 8 the sun makes in the sky when you view it from the same place at the same time every day. You can look it up online if you haven't heard of it before. I've also written an article about it, which I'll link in the comments. But Jesus, after his death, he appears 8 times. His number in Greek gematria is also 888. Now, Krishna was also known as the 8th avatar of Lord Vishnu, and of course Buddha's most famous teaching is the 8th-fold path. So all of these attributes are sun symbols in their own right. You can also look at the context of the cross again and the tree and how they relate. The cross typically today is considered a Christian symbol, but it's much older. It's a much older pagan symbol, and it's actually dated to the Paleolithic. Again, I can link to an article showing that particular symbol, which was a variant of the cross called the Chi-Rho. And the Chi-Rho is the cross symbol with a kind of curve at the top. So the cross really symbolizes the 2 equinoxes and the 2 solstices, and the center point from which the kind of hook symbol emanates is meant to represent man in the center, or also Jesus, the sun, the kind of sacrificial figure in the center. So the sun is in the center of the 2 equinoxes and the 2 solstices. Another good example of that number 8 recurring in ancient traditions is, of course, the pagan wheel of the year. Also the lemniscat symbol, which appears, I suppose, most famously in tarot today, but it's been around much longer. I suppose the earliest representations of the Ouroboros is also a number 8, a serpentine figure like that, which associates back to Hermes and his caduceus. When we look at the equinoxes and the solstices, of course, then we can't ignore the links to Mithras and to previous pagan deities. Freakin Gandhi's book, The Jesus Mysteries, can give a much more comprehensive overview of those links and associations than I can in this short video. So I would recommend reading that particular book. But I suppose I should also say this is not an easy book to read. Even in the forward, Acharya S, she comments upon the amount of resources she used, and there are like huge sections of previous scholars' work which she uses in order to back her own arguments. And ultimately, when you get to the end of it, what you've got to ask yourself is, what's left for these supposed historical figures then? If all of their main attributes can be traced in different orders and at different times in their lives, but if you can find the same motifs, the same allegory, the same story, it's like an onion, as Acharya S says. If you strip away layer after layer after layer, you're left with nothing. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't itinerant preachers, figures like Jesus. We know there are certain figures called Jesus, but are these figures the deity that is worshipped by Christians today? Is the Buddha, which, don't forget, for Buddha, he was said to have been born around 550 BC, and yet, like many pagan stories, many Christian saint stories, it's hundreds of years later before the first written accounts of his life are compiled. So it makes you wonder about the accuracy and what legends have been associated with him, and all the sun symbolism then that comes upon this. Buddhism itself, of course, broke away from the Vedic type teachings, which were shamanistic in nature, and again associated in a lot of ways with the sun. And for Krishna, there are different birth times given, but I suppose the most common one is around 3,500 BCE. So it's very hard to argue for these figures being historical. Of course, if you're a person of faith, it can also be just as hard to accept that they're not. This is a tough book to read at times. As I said, there are lots of sections where she's taken work from scholars, 19th century scholars, and it's kind of, it interrupted the flow for me. But maybe that was because I knew quite a lot about this particular idea before I read this book. I guess I find the controversy about the mythic Jesus, I find it absurd sometimes, because if you look at the Golden Bough, for example, it's not new. You know, I know, I think it was Graves' book, 16 Crucified Saviours, had quite a lot of errors in it, but he was still, the errors are down to this literalism versus symbolic representations. The symbolism is still valid, even if he gets it wrong sometimes in terms of his placement. And there's certainly much less criticism of Fraser in the Golden Bough when he talks about Jesus and the pagan sun figures. I guess Acharya S.'s style of debate was quite confrontational in a good way, I suppose. She was passionate about her work. She certainly believed that she had the proof to back up her claims. The Christ conspiracy got a lot of criticism from Robert Price in particular, but he ended up doing a foreword to a later book, which goes to show how she managed to, how her style was so, she could back herself up to a point where she won over some of her previous critics. The idea of the sun being related to pagan deities and to Jesus, to me, I think it's a sound argument. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a version of Jesus going around, but he's not the figure of Christianity today, in my opinion. So, Sons of God by Acharya S. is another book that I think every occultist should read. One final thing, I think Acharya S. maybe should have pitched this book to those of us in the occult area who would be more receptive to symbolism, rather than trying to take on classical academia. But that's just a personal opinion. So I'll see you next week for another occult book review. Thanks for watching.